Hey guys, welcome back to Vanta EDC. As you can see, today we are going to be taking a look at the Demko AD20.5. And this version is, as you can see, the all-black version, the DLC blade, in 3V steel, CPM 3V. So, yeah, just going to start with kind of giving a brief explanation as to why I decided to get this knife in the first place. One of the big things that I've mentioned in previous videos is that I'm on the quest for the ideal EDC knife, and to me a core aspect of the ideal EDC knife for me is a knife where you can do safe and quick one-handed closure. And when I say safe, I mean essentially not having my fingers in the path of the blade as it's supposed to close. So essentially that rules out liner locks, frame locks, mainly, yeah, those. So to me, the most obvious choice then would be a button lock, but the shark lock being a new innovation that completely removes your fingers from the path of the blade when it's closing. It definitely was something I wanted to try out for myself to see if it might be a good alternative to a button lock. So yeah, that was the first reason. The second reason is knowing how slim this knife is. I believe it's only 0.39 inches thick in this version with the gravity scales. I love how thin it is because to me having a knife that sits in my pocket without protruding too much is a pretty high priority for me personally. So yeah, and yeah, those are the two big reasons why I wanted to get this knife and try it for myself, having seen a lot of really positive reviews on it. So I got this. So now we're going to just dig into the details of this knife and what I particularly like about it. So I've already mentioned the slimness, so that's a big one. I think another thing that I didn't really think about too much or appreciate that much in theory before actually buying it, but I can appreciate now having handled it, is the strength to weight ratio on this knife. And when I say strength, I mean the strength of the locking mechanism and the overall solidity of the knife, despite it being having gravity scales. And this version only weighs 3.53 ounces supposedly. So and I believe this is a 3-inch blade, the shark foot version here. So the overall strength of the lock and the overall body of the knife compared to the weight being only 3.5 ounces, I think it's really good. You can tell, and there's a lot of aspects, not just that, but that we'll get into more, a lot of aspects of this knife where you can tell that one of the priorities was having a hard use knife, one that will take a decent amount of, I don't want to say abuse, but can take hard use without giving up or kind of being too frail. And so yeah, I think that's a aspect of this knife that I can appreciate, even though I'm not a hard user by any means. Another thing that I personally appreciate about this knife is the overall blade profile. They call this the shark foot. Essentially it's a sheep's foot blade, but I can understand why they call it a shark foot blade. I like this. It's not perfectly flat edge, but that's okay. And you're able to get your finger up here, almost to the tip, almost to the down slope at the very end of the blade. So I think this is, to me, I prefer, for knives that are going to be users, I prefer having a Wharncliffe, sheep's foot, reverse tanto, whatever you want to call it, style blade shape. So yeah, this, I think the profile is one that I can appreciate. Another thing that I really do appreciate is how far up the jimping goes up the spine of the blade. So notice from this angle, it's almost 50% of the length of the blade. I would say it's about 45% of the length of the blade. And the jimping is pretty comfortable at that too, but it does offer enough traction. And so for me, if I'm back here, definitely more than enough jimping. You see there's all that left. And then if I come up here, then I can get all the way up here with the jimping and I still feel very secure on it. So, if you were to get this knife, or if you do have this knife and you're a hard user, I think that's a really great feature of it and really gives you a lot more control when you're choked up on it. So yeah, another thing that I appreciate about this knife is even though I don't personally love the aesthetic silhouette of the knife in a lot of ways. I do love how utilitarian the silhouette is. So notice there's this index finger trail here, and then for your other 3 fingers, you can lock in. For me, I have medium-sized gloves, so I wear medium-sized gloves, so my hand fits perfectly within the confines of these 2 points here, near the top and the bottom of the scales. And so I feel very locked in. I'm not too worried about slipping up on the knife if for whatever reason I was to be pushing in. And I'm not too worried about slipping off the back either. On top of that, actually, not that you're going to be using this grip very often, if at all, but just if I'm kind of often fidgeting around with this knife, I like that this rounded butt end of the knife makes it really nice to kind of wrap your thumb around. It's very natural, kind of melts into the crook of the bend of my thumb knuckle right there. So yeah, I do like that you can come above this protrusion right here and kind of rest here. I wish there was more of a choil in the blade here so that I wasn't too worried about potentially slipping up onto the blade there. But you know, I'm not that much of a hard user with knives in general, and not with this knife, so I'm not too worried about it personally, but I can imagine that some people might appreciate that in particular. Now, another thing, small detail that I appreciate is the profile of the clip in some respects. Now, what I mean is overall the height the height over the scale that the clip comes is not so high such that when I'm holding the knife I feel it that much. In fact, it kind of rests right here, kind of inside on the bottom side of my knuckles right there, in a very comfortable way. So it's barely noticeable. There's no, like the bill of the clip is not creating a hot spot. I don't feel any hot spots really at all. So I definitely appreciate that aspect of the clip. There's other aspects of the clip that I don't prefer, but we'll get into that later. Another detail I do like this finger hole. I like how generous it is in terms of how long it goes, because you know, just depending on the size of the length of your middle finger, the size of your fingers, where you kind of tend to grip the knife, that it gives you a little more options of where to place your finger to flick it open. I don't really do fast thumb flicks, but it does make it easy to roll this knife out. You can also do that on the thumb stud as well. There's actually, within the limited number of knives I have in my own collection, this is one of the easier knives to roll out, partially because the tension created by the lock prevents the knife from wanting to snap out super quickly, like a lot of other knives do. So yeah, I do like that aspect of it. Another thing I do like the pivot design, in the sense that it kind of looks like the case head of a bullet, of a round. I'm into guns as well, so I can appreciate that aesthetic in some regard. I do wish it was flipped over to the show side of the scales. Although, depending on if you're righty or lefty, if you're lefty, I guess this is the show side. But yeah, as a righty, this is the show side. I wish the Torx head was on the clip side. But if you're lefty, then that's the show side, and that works out perfectly for you. So anyway, yeah, the last thing I'll mention is, you can't technically see it here, but there's a provision, and when you get this knife, I don't know if every single version ships with this, but when I got this shipped to me from Knife Center, it came in the packaging with a lefty version of the clip. Notice how this clip is not ambidextrous in and of itself, but there are provisions to install a lefty clip here. So even though I'm not a lefty, I just can appreciate that for people that are lefties. So yeah, those are the big details, the small details that I appreciate about this knife. Now, the things that I would change if I could have my personal preference on this knife design overall. A lot of it has to do with the lock. So the two big things are the texturing on the shark lock here, and this is not a new criticism to this knife. It's really not a big deal. when you're only opening and closing the knife once or twice in a short span of time. But if you're fidgeting around with this like I am wont to do, the jimping here on the front side of the lock, or whatever you want to call it, this face of the lock, it doesn't feel that aggressive innately, but the more you actuate the lock in a short period of time, you'll feel your index finger, or whichever finger you use, getting a little raw from manipulating it. So if they could, I guess, make it a little shallower or something, I don't know exactly what would solve it. Maybe do fewer grooves. I think there's 4 grooves. It's probably going to be too hard to see on camera here. It won't want to focus, but there are about 4 grooves that are milled into that face of the lock. And so I think if they were to make it either fewer grooves or less deep of grooves, I think it would be better. Now, the other big aspect of the lock that I don't love is the amount of resistance that the spring is exerting. So basically the way the shark lock works, if you don't know, is inside here. So there's a metal piece. You can see it from here. It extends from here to here. And inside that metal piece is a coil spring. And basically when you, I'm gonna be careful when I'm doing this. Basically when you pull this back, you are compressing the spring, and you are removing this whole metal piece from the tang of the blade here. It's kind of hard to see from this angle, but you're removing it and allowing the knife to pivot, the blade to pivot. And so then when you bring it back into the open position, the fully open position, the spring tension forces the lock onto the tang of the blade on this side. And so it's very firm. Now I understand that I would imagine that the priority of the design again was strength, and so I understand that there's a lot of spring tension to avoid accidental unlocking, and I definitely have not worried at all that this lock is going to disengage with any amount of downward force or force onto the spine of the blade. But all that to say, as someone who's not using this knife in nearly that harsh of a manner, someone who's really just fidgeting with this more, to be honest, the amount of tension on it, I believe, makes it, I was surprised when I first got it, and just am generally, having had this now for 3 months, generally don't love the amount of tension that I'm needing to overcome in order to deploy the blade. So notice how as you move the blade, this is even with me not touching the shark lock, right, moving the blade compresses the spring until you get here to the fully open position. So when I'm opening it, it's very easy, notice that, to fail this relative to other more traditional knives, whether it's a button lock or a liner lock or frame lock, where because there's no actual technical ball detent here, what you're working against is the spring pressure as your quote unquote detent from a more conceptual standpoint. It's really easy to slip off, and if you're not applying the right vectors of pressure, so I kind of have to consciously make sure if I'm doing a middle finger flick, push my finger up, to the side of the blade and outward and upward all simultaneously, and I have to do it more so than I would with almost any other knife that I own. It's not impossible by any means, but it is more concerted effort and more overall force than I apply to basically any other knife on bearings that I've handled. So it's not terrible by any means, but it's just not something that I was, I guess, mainly expecting, just because I don't know, I didn't give it that much credence beforehand. I never heard anyone mention it in all the YouTube reviews from Metal Complex or Nick Shabazz, whoever else. I hadn't heard them really address this particular fact that the spring tension is somewhat strong. So I have considered buying a pack of springs, and maybe like springs you can actually get designed for the 20.5, and trimming one of them down a little bit to see if decreasing the overall length of the spring helps reduce the spring tension but doesn't weaken the lock so much that I'm worried about the safety of it, because at the end of the day, safety is very critical. So anyway, I don't want to get too much on that, but really the resistance of the shark lock and the texturing of the shark lock are the two biggest things I would change. Now, the other things that I would change, and this has been changed in some sense, is if I could go back, I would not get the 3V version. This is my only experience with 3V, so maybe this is just a bad example of 3V for whatever reason. I'm not an expert on heat treats or Rockwell hardness or anything, but one of the first times I used this knife was to cut open that sort of vacuum sealed, like rigid plastic packaging that you get with like small items. I think it was like screws or something, or it was like a set of actually Torx heads or something like that. But I was trying to cut it open, and the edges of the packaging are these like very crimped, very rigid aspect of it. And so I tried cutting through the whole package, and I did. But then it's going to be hard to tell. But basically, I rolled the edge, and that was, I mean, it's plastic, so in some ways it shouldn't be that stiff. So you can kind of see it here. It's right in this spot, so you might see the light catching it right there. Yeah, it's not terrible by any means, but I noticed right before I started recording that there's a lot more sort of small, I guess they might be rolls, or honestly it might be chipping. So, you know, my understanding is that 3V is desirable because of its toughness. Now, I don't know how much toughness and, like, I guess if this is like an edge retention thing, like parameter more so, but either way, I feel like this steel is not great. So, you know, maybe I just have a bad example, and this is just a bad batch of blades or something like that. But I would prefer to have this probably in S35, or maybe even, you know, Magna Cut would be, I think, probably optimal, but again, I'm kind of a noob when it comes to blade steel, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But yeah, I just haven't had a great experience, and I really have not been a hard user on this blade, as I've said multiple times. So I would just get a different version personally. I don't recommend this version, but if you have good experiences with 3V and or this, like the 20.5 and 3V, please let me know, because I'd be curious if mine is an anomaly. So yeah. Another thing that I would change is, even though I mentioned I like the overall shape, the silhouette of the blade, I do wish personally that the grind was either a hollow grind or a higher flat grind. Now I say that, but I would imagine that the reason that it was ground this way is for the strength of this sort of profile. It's a pretty thick flat grind here. Relatively thick behind the edge, given the overall thickness of the knife, all things considered. So again, I can totally appreciate that the Demkos probably wanted this to be a tough blade and not so much a slicey blade, and so I can fully respect that. But just if I were to totally customize this to my preferences, I would prefer to have a hollow grind or a higher flat grind. So one thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about is the texture of the feel of this grivery. I don't have any other grivery, so I can't compare this to other examples of it, but I don't love it personally. I do think they did a good job with the way they textured it, but even still, it does feel pretty slick compared to like G10. And maybe it is just a matter of the way they textured it. If this was like a finer pattern, I would definitely be interested in trying it. I know that there are G10 scales out there, but at this point, and I'll talk about this a little more, is I don't know if this is a knife that I'm going to hang on to forever. So I just don't know if I want to invest money in getting G10 scales that have better texture and that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't love it. I don't absolutely hate it, but it's definitely not my favorite, feeling scale. Now, I mentioned the clip earlier. I do like how flat the clip is and doesn't really create hot spots. Now, notice how low the bill is relative to the main, I guess, portion of the clip here. It's really hard to naturally snag this on the lip of pants and shorts that I wear. So, I mean, I'm sure I could like bend this out if I really wanted to, but honestly, I'm not going to go through that hassle. It's not that big of a deal. If I just grab my pant pocket with my left hand and push this in with my right hand, generally I'm able to pocket it without too much issue. So, and again, I know that there are aftermarket clips that are both deeper carry, which is another thing. I wish they just by default gave this a deep carry clip. I'm kind of curious what reason they didn't do that from the get-go. But yeah, deep carry clip and the shallowness of the bill height, I think those are the two issues with the clip that I don't love personally. Now, one thing that I'm kind of curious about, knowing how many aspects of this design were, I guess, geared towards the strength and toughness of this knife, I'm kind of curious why they chose bearings, because I feel like, and this is probably in some ways a gross oversimplification, but the fact that this knife is designed for hard work and hard use. To me, having a knife on washers would make a little more sense. Now, I don't know if, again, I don't have much experience like beating a knife up, doing a million things in like sawdust and sand and dirt and whatnot, or metal shavings even. But yeah, that's just something that I know just in general. When you have a knife on bearings versus a knife on washers, you're more likely to get debris caught up in the action. So that's just something that I think more so. I'm just kind of curious why they decided to go with bearings. It is a smooth design so I'm not complaining about that, but a smooth action, I mean. But yeah, at the same time, it's kind of curious. It seems like it's kind of somewhat contradictory to the overall design ethos of this knife. So yeah. And the last thing I would change is, honestly, this thumb stud is kind of unnecessary with this finger slot. I find that it's harder to actuate. I'm more likely to like slip off. Notice how slow the action is there. It's harder for me to generate enough force to deploy the blade fully. I have to like really get behind it if I'm using the thumb stud versus, partially because I'm getting farther out on the lever that is the blade, I'm able to deploy it easier using the finger slot. But I guess at the end of the day they have space for it, so it doesn't hurt, but I don't need it personally. So yeah, that's kind of my personal takes on this knife. I kind of mentioned it, but I don't know. I don't think I'm gonna. I definitely don't feel the need to keep this around long term. I also don't have the need to get rid of it right now, because it does kind of fit a niche in terms of my small collection of being more geared towards hard use. Whenever I do know I'm going to be working outside or doing more manual labor, just whatever that might be. I feel more confident taking this with me versus my Civivi Altis or Pyrite, because those are definitely more delicate than this knife is. So if I get a better hard user that is a quick and safe, like one-handed closure type knife, I definitely would consider getting rid of this. And so the first knife that comes to mind, and it's a knife that I'm planning on getting at some point, is the Spyderco Para 3 in S45. So that's a knife that's on washers, and the compression lock means your fingers are completely out of the blade path when you are disengaging the lock and closing the blade. So that's a knife that I'm interested in trying out that could possibly dethrone this. But yeah, until I get that, or maybe honestly, if they do a production version of the AD22, if you've heard of that. There's not too many videos on YouTube right now, but there are a few. That seems potentially like, but just given that it's also a shark lock knife, I'm assuming it has the same gripes that I have with the resistance on the spring and whatnot. So I think this is good design. It doesn't fit all my personal preferences when it comes to a optimal EDC knife. So yeah, thanks for taking the time to listen. Hope you found something helpful or interesting. And if you have any, counterpoints or additional info to add, feel free to comment. Yeah, take care.